Okay, the final session of the day at OER 19 with Virtually Connecting. My name is Christian Friedrich. I'm your virtually buddy for today, and I'd like to hand it over to the folks on site to do a quick round of introduction. It will be kind of a sprint-ish session. I don't know if that's a term, but I'm just pointing it out. We have about 20, 21, 22 minutes before the on-site folks will have to get going. Just wanted to get that out there quickly. So, on-site folks, do you want to go ahead and start, and then we'll introduce the virtual folks as well.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Sheila McNeil, Chair of Vault, the on-site buddy for this, and I'm going to talk very, very quickly and pass over to the other people who are far more interesting than me, our star of the day.
Oh, okay, I'm Sue, and I'm a sociologist, and I work here in NUI Galway.
And she just did an amazing keynote this morning as well. So
amazing.
we'll talk about that. Amazing.
All right, I'm Bonnie Stewart. I'm from the University of Windsor in Ontario, Canada, and I am delighted to be here in Galway.
Hi, I'm Debbie Baff, and I'm a PhD student. I'm here with the GoGeners, and I'm also a Senior Academic Developer at Swansea, and I'm very excited to be in here with these lovely ladies.
There's a lot of love in this room.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'd say we'd started as with Teresa, then maybe Jess and Greg. Would that be okay?
Yeah, sure. I'll just quickly dive in. I'm Teresa McKinnon at Warwick Language on Twitter, and I'm virtual buddying. I've seen many of you now virtually for a long, long time, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the on-site folk again today.
Thank you.
Good morning, Jess O'Reilly in Ontario, Canada. Also really looking forward to this virtually connecting session. I wasn't able to catch the keynote, so I hope I get the Coles notes, and then I'll go back and watch the full thing on YouTube.
Awesome. And I'm Greg McVeary, and I'm in New Haven, Connecticut. And I thought the keynote was awesome, and it's great to see so many new faces and old faces who I've never met before, all in one place. So I love my virtually connecting crew.
Sadiq, your turn.
Hi everyone, my name is Sadiq Shahadi from Ghana. I'm with the Wikimedia Ghana user group and Creative Commons Ghana chapter, and I've been lately working on a project with Greg. Is helping us so much with our OER network. We luckily had some funding from his university who agreed to cover the cost of our web hosting and domain. So he's taking us through all the basic stuff with the known platform, and then in the web and stuff like that. So I've learned so much already. Basically, that's what we do. And we are also working on the language translation projects here in Ghana. Our next session is this Saturday. We are translating English Wikipedia content to our local language, which is Twi Wikipedia. Yeah, so that's what we're working on. Yeah.
Sounds awesome. Thanks for the rounds of introduction. So I think you folks on site have the not that feasible task of summarizing OER 19 and the keynote and the day in the next 17 minutes. Go. No, I'm just kidding. Just what's the atmosphere on site? How are you guys doing? What's the connections like? What's the conversations? What are your impressions?
I think it's been the atmosphere is fantastic here, I think, and that's partly to do with the amazing keynotes we've had yesterday and obviously this morning. I think, Sue, you gave us so much to think about and contextualize it in such a thought-provoking way. So, yeah, for me, I'm still processing many of the things you said about, I suppose, the interrelationships and how your view of opening up open, which would be really interesting, I'm sure, for everyone to hear more.
Yeah, so I'm a visitor to Open. I'm not a resident in Open. And I've just been welcomed into this open-ended, wide open community, which is also incredibly warm and real in the relationships. So this is a kind of a real testament, I think, to the power of relationships and how community is built in the open. And I kind of was thinking a lot about quilts after Kate Bowles' amazing keynote yesterday. And I had a whole section about quilts, which I excised from the keynote because okay, we've done the quilts, we've done them. But that whole idea of, I was thinking a lot about in ecofeminist theory, how we accommodate difference and how much, and thinking and reflecting on all the people who put care in design, in getting the pieces, in providing the backing and the wadding and the things that are never seen. And all of that, I thought, really kind of was a metaphor for me for what goes on, that people come into the space and we agree what is inside the borders, in an unspoken way, of what is inside the borders of the quilt. And in fact, it was so interesting that the borders are very unrestraining borders. They're borders that are interested in critical reflective practice, in situating the self in practices. And I just think it's really heartening, and also it's a materially very enriching and a really wonderful community to be part of. So that was just a little impression of where I was. And you can watch the YouTube, so you don't need to go over all the points on what openness is. But yeah, I thought that it's just this idea that I also took from Kate's motif yesterday of the dried up river, and thinking about what we need to replenish whatever it is, which are the rivers and the water and the practices and the ferns and the trees and the animals of our existence that we need to keep our practices alive and to keep our community flourishing. And that we need care, and the importance, I think, of actually being much more forward in thinking of the things, these dark forces that we need to counter, and to be much more forward in anti-racism and in this idea of being eccentric and being educational. So those were the kind of main thoughts that I had.
That's really, it was very powerful, but that's actually just the background metaphor through which you just explained it, adding in back in the quilting piece is also really powerful. You mentioned the warmth of this community, and I thought it was really interesting that both yourself and Kate identify kind of as not resident to open. I think there are actually many of us here who are adjacent or partly embedded. I don't know if that's my primary community, but there is I have been lucky enough to always feel a warmth and welcome, and that's very much what the on the ground feeling is here. I met a lot of new people last evening from different parts of the world that I didn't know online before, as well as getting to connect with people, some of whom I've known online at least for 10 years. So that there's a nice mix of people here. But one of the pieces that I think is really important that seems different from, and I haven't been to an OER before, so this is my first time at OER. But many of the open conferences that I've been to in the past, we seem to be moving into an era where we are all recognizing that it's time to talk about change and the structural forces that sustain us institutionally and that don't sustain us. That metaphor of the river that Kate used in her talk yesterday was actually a dried up river because too much has been taken out upstream. And she likened that to higher education. We've taken so much out upstream that what we're left with at the places where many of us work, not just geographically and institutionally, but within those structures, what we're left with to teach students with, what we're left with precarious contracts, what we're left with is a trickle. And often the piece that I'm interested in, the piece that I was talking about yesterday was, I think a big part of what has built this community is that many of the folks, even who are open adjacent because we have been involved in some form of participatory engagement on the web, sometimes for a long time, sometimes for a recent time, but have been acculturated to that tradition of sharing. Whereas a lot of folks in higher ed decision-making strata have never really been exposed to that part of the web. They don't get it, they don't practice it, they don't understand it, and therefore they're not valuing it in the technocratic digital decisions that are being made. And I think it is incumbent on us, open or open adjacent, at this point, to try to make that visible, because to me that is one of the only forms of bringing those relationships and humanness in to counter some of the, it's not that I don't see value in some of the AI and analytics developments that we have, I do, but in terms of having those drive the future of higher ed, that actually takes higher ed really out of the knowledge equation in our society. That turns it over to Silicon Valley. And so we need to make a case for something different.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. And I think that interesting how you say you're not part of the open community and that open adjacent. That's a really nice phrase. I think that as well. I mean, I feel that my engagement, I suppose this is engagement in any type of community, it waxes and wanes. And sometimes, obviously this is a huge kind of critical point for the community these 2 days. So we're all here. But in my practice, what I've noticed over the last couple of years, that it's harder for me to identify my open practice within my institution. And I think that's a sign of what's happening in terms of the politics within my institution and the wider political situation that we're here. But I think I always have, I think the resilience of the community and actually just knowing that the people are out there. And again, ensuring that we keep communicating and participating and sharing what we're doing, and being able to extend our community all the time. And I think that's the thing for people. I've spoken to so many people who said, oh, I don't really do open, but I've been here and I actually kind of realized that I do. So I think actually I think that's something that as a community we need to savor, actually, that go back to your kind of edges. There are no edges on this community, and I hope not. So I think
when we find them, we need to find ways to make people feel welcome.
Then there's more porosity between them, and kind of like there's a membrane something.
I did want to talk about.
Jump in quickly. I'm sorry, Paul. We've just been joined by. On the one hand, I wanted to give Wendy Talio, who just joined us, a chance to say hello and do a quick introduction of herself. Hi, Wendy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I was a bit late. Sheila, Bonnie, I know, and hello. Wendy Talio from Central Australia. Just finished my master's with the Open University UK and learning technologist working for Charles Darwin University. So really enjoying the conversation. Thank you.
Glad to have you. Hi. I'm sorry to interrupt there. But there's been some conversations in the chat as well. I thought
Let's see if there's any questions that we can take.
I think there's one sort of from Greg.
Yeah, so I've been loving the quilt metaphor. I mean, that's a metaphor that goes back. I remember even when I was an undergrad, like the first thing, like we did multicultural education by making our diversity quilts. Like it was always like this bricolage. It's always the AIDS quilt. It's been a long-standing metaphor, at least here in the United States. And I love that idea that the borders are kind of framed, but what happens on the inside is up to each individual panel. But then that got me thinking, the stitching patterns and the thread that nobody sees, those go back hundreds of years. Like we're using the same stitch pattern on quilts that we've used forever. So, and I feel like that's the part that's kind of been missing in our open movement is how can we build a quilt, but then what is the stitch that nobody sees? Like, and is that, or am I just pushing this metaphor too far?
I think a lot of that's to do with humanity and care, which is coming.
I think it is the participatory idea for me, at least. Like I'll jump in, and I'm totally open to being shot down on this, but I think that idea of participatory relationship building, which actually itself, like in quilting, does go back. It has an adult ed history that goes back to, the Antigonish movement in Nova Scotia is 100 years ago, historical metaphor for it, the Highlander Center. There are all these traditions of bringing adults into learning by building on what they know and where they are, and building relationships with people where they are so they can work together. That's how I see it. What do you think? I wanted to turn it over to you because you're in a PhD program.
Yeah, I'm in a PhD program, and what I'm looking at is this very thing. I'm looking at how people connect, why they connect, and how they sustain that connection over a period of time and how it changes. So for me, it's an absolute gift. I've gone to things going, wow, I've got to write that down. It's really, really good.
Yeah, I love the attention to the stitch. right? And I wanted to bring that to the fore and make the suturing, the stitching visible, and having that visual metaphor to be able to think about bringing together edges of difference, edges that might be cleaved from really quite terrible things happening. But that the stitch itself is a kind of humble thing, and we don't see it. It's normally invisible. And that's what Kata Attia is trying to do in his art, is to make it obvious, to make it a thing of value, because that's what's holding the pieces together. And that we shouldn't try and disguise it and paint over it and mask it, but actually that's part of what it is. That's what it is. It's the relationship. So to me, that those artworks spoke very, very strongly to me.
Very much so. And they still parallel. I know Jess brought up in the chat here that she sees solid educational theory as part of the stitches, and constructivism particularly. And I remember when Martin Weller did his 25 Years of Open series last year, I think 1997 or something, he talked about constructivism, right? And constructivism was the foundational theory for a lot of the participatory ways that early EdTech and early open got started. And part of what's happened is that they have been kind of pushed to the edges or the margins within our institutions. Early on, a lot of the folks who were involved in digital higher education had that background and that open piece because that was what was circulating. And increasingly there's been this push away from that to much more automated things. And I do think we need to center that stitching and look at constructivism and our theoretical bounds, not necessarily even look at them as theory, but just value them for being there. Recognize that without those stitches, we don't have the quilt we think we have.
Beautifully said, Bonnie. That was you couldn't have put it better, especially at 7:56 a.m. Ontario time. And actually, it's reminiscent for me of Kate's keynote yesterday, right? And that valuing of academic labor. Why is constructivism getting pushed aside? Well, it takes a bit more time, doesn't it, to build and support and provide that qualitative feedback, the relational aspect of learning. I think of the community of inquiry model as well, and that's something that doesn't get a lot of traction, and often because of the humanity, the relationship, that key connection between facilitator and learner isn't really privileged in that click automated style analytic learning. So all very connected. And maybe the problem is that the stitching isn't visible. Maybe it really does need to be brought to the foreground, as you say.
Can I just say something about what I think the stitch needs to go across? And sometimes there's actually that's I talked about wounds, and I think that there's a big abyss to cross in the stitching, in this repair that has to be made, because abolition is still necessary, and it hasn't finished yet. So you can't, unless people are able to reach the edges. The edges can't be brought together if the gap is too big. And I think that there is something there in confronting really existing injustice that prevent people from being present at the repair.
And also, I think just actually, I think this is where critical pedagogy plays a role. They're actually allowing people to understand that there are stitches and what they are and what how they would use stitching to mend some of these scars or whatever. So I think it's actually giving people that criticality, and I think that's what we're losing from senior management. And what you're talking about constructivism, that it's still alive and well in my part of the world, but there is that tendency through technology to slip into more behaviorist styles, and there is it's a solution.
Well,
so actually we'll automate everything, and we'll have that. We've got the sewing machine now to do it. So
but there's a sort of an alignment.
Those are two conversations almost, right? Whereas in a sense, what's happened is higher education has moved further and further back towards behaviorism, back towards solutionism, because it's handy and easy and the bottom line is great. And those wounds are not even on the table from that perspective, right? And that's a real problem as well. And again, I think it is incumbent on those of us who have a different perspective. It's important to bring some of the stitching back in, both to try to speak to higher ed as a whole, but also to try to address the edges that have not yet been opened. And both of those things happening at once is definitely a challenge.
Yeah, I've kind of given up on trying to do this inside of higher ed, and I'm just doing it on my own. That's like, I've been working with Sadiq. It was like, wait a minute, we can find $200. We can get an OER network launched in Ghana. Like, if I wait and get all the permissions and the paper signed by the 3 different people to then go signed by the 3 other different people. It was like, no, we don't. We can just, let's teach people to sew, not just wrap them in a quilt. Kind of approach. But I agree with Bonnie, because it's just getting worse and worse. I mean, I wish I had better news, but I don't sometimes feel that hopeful with higher ed. I can't lie.
Yeah, well, I think that actually there was something in, was it yesterday? I can't remember. Between, no, actually, it was a discussion of Sarah Lambert's social justice centered, and she has these 2 categories. You know, the kind of the soft and the ameliorative, and then there's the transformative. But then there's actually in Andreotti's work, which they draw on, there's a 3rd category, which is the beyond. And I think that's what you're talking about, Greg, that actually there's a beyond, and maybe it's not about higher education, and it isn't all about higher education, and open is beyond, more than that, and it is beyond. And so it doesn't all have to be about higher education, absolutely not, even though higher education always thinks it's about it.
And I think that beyond, somebody asked, you know, is there a risk we assume that Western academic theory should dominate the discourse? Absolutely a risk. For me, a lot of what is beyond Western academic theories is still beyond for me. And that's my learning place that I need to do from within where I'm at in this quilt, while still pushing back at the behaviorism that is the system that I'm working in. And so, again, both of those things, I need to remain open to both.
So when we started out, I promised that I would get you out of this by, I think, 1 p.m. your time, which we have just missed. I'm not sure how pressing your time issues are, but I'm from my own conference experience, there's lots of conversations to attend to, especially on the last day of a conference. So I don't want to, how do you say that? I don't want to take too much more of your time, and at least give you this moment as a chance to get out of this if you want to. We really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for taking the time, especially like for the last session from OER 19. We can keep the conversation going a bit, but I will stop the broadcast now to give us time to relax a bit. So thank you, everybody, for...
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Talk to you.
Bye.